Trump essentially backing down in this Kavanaugh fight, and this is really for the second time in less than a week. It was just days ago that Trump first relented, agreeing to reopen the FBI's Kavanaugh probe after claiming, well, that's maybe not what the FBI does. Now, tonight's news is Trump has agreed to critics' calls for an expanded FBI probe of Brett Kavanaugh. That means FBI agents can speak to anyone necessary as long as it all ends by Friday. So, basically, the White House is no longer micromanaging the direction of the probe of who they can talk to, but they're still insisting on a tight and, let's admit it, arbitrary deadline. New York Times reporting the FBI has already interviewed the 4 people that it was authorized to. And as Trump alluded to today, those people, that list does not include Julie Swetnick, a third Kavanaugh accuser.
So just to be clear, should the FBI interview all 3 of Brett Kavanaugh's accusers?
It wouldn't bother me at all. Now, it depends. I don't know all 3 of the accusers.
All 3.
Certainly, I imagine they're going to interview 2. The third one I don't know much about, but it wouldn't bother me at all. I mean, I've been heard that the third one has, I have no idea if this is true, has very little credibility. If there is any credibility, interview the third one.
Should Brett Kavanaugh be interviewed by the FBI?
I think so. I think it's fine if they do.
Swetnick's lawyer, Michael Avenatti, has spoken about her case, but she has not until tonight. You will hear from Ms. Swetnick for the first time in an NBC News exclusive in a few moments right here on The Beat. The other big issue, though, tonight is testimony from Kavanaugh's friends, like Mark Judge, who's now spoken to the FBI, as well as their credibility. New reports that his former girlfriend says she wants to speak with the FBI but hasn't gotten much of a substantive response. Now, the FBI can talk to these people around the main parties as well. NBC reporting Kavanaugh's team tried to talk to some of them, encouraging accounts that would back him up. Another college classmate of Kavanaugh alleges that he would get belligerent and aggressive while drinking. So a lot of different accounts swirling around. We begin tonight with Senator Richard Blumenthal, a Democrat from Connecticut who is on the Judiciary Committee. He signed a letter today listing about 24 witnesses that they believe the FBI should interview. I'm also joined by former Democratic Senator Carol Moseley Braun. She won her seat in 1992, often referred to as the Year of the Woman. She was also the 3rd woman ever to serve on the Senate Judiciary Committee. Thanks to both of you. Senator Blumenthal, when you look at the direction we're going in here, what the president said, the FBI expanding aspects of the probe, do you feel this is the right direction?
It certainly is the right direction, but whether they really go far enough and quickly enough remains to be seen. My mantra is distrust but verify. Those 25 witnesses, potential interviewees that I sent to the White House and to the FBI, along with almost all my colleagues on the Judiciary Committee, Democratic side, are the minimum that ought to be interviewed. And as you well know from your own experience, witnesses can lead to other witnesses that have to be pursued. So I believe that Jeff Flake truly wants a real investigation, not a check-the-box sham, and that's what the FBI ought to be doing. Difficult, though, because, as you said very well, this deadline is tight and arbitrary, in fact, too accelerated and too artificial to really get the job done.
One of the things that's come through in the process is increased scrutiny on whether Brett Kavanaugh, who's a sitting federal judge, who was testifying under oath, has been wholly truthful throughout. And you got at that point in your exchange with him. Let's take a look.
You're aware of the jury instruction, falsus in unibus, falsus in omnibus, are you not? You're aware of that jury instruction?
Yeah, I am.
You know what it means?
You can translate it for me, Senator. You can do it better than I can.
False in one thing, false in everything.
What were you getting at there, and are you at a junction after a few days here where you can say that you think he did make materially false statements to the Senate, or are you not there yet?
I think he definitely was evasive and seemingly misleading. He made statements that were directly contradicted by facts and now have been impugned by other potential witnesses who have come forward, who should be interviewed under oath. I would never judge right now that a sitting judge would be prosecuted for perjury based on what we know, but there is certainly reason for the FBI to be investigating that issue. Right. And that investigation, by the way, Ari, is going to go on whether it occurs before the vote or afterwards. Not like the wrongdoing goes away just because of the vote.
Senator, stay with me as I turn to another former senator. And Senator Braun, I want to play for you a little sound from two other senators. I'm sure you know the expression, ain't no party like a senator party, because a senator party is full of filibustering. Do you know that one? It's an oldie, but a goodie.
Everything's been said, but not everybody said it, right?
Exactly. But this is relatively short for senator on senator analysis. A Republican and a Democrat in a much watched, much intrigue 60 Minutes appearance last night about potential false statements by Kavanaugh. Take a look.
If Judge Kavanaugh is shown to have lied to the committee, nomination's over?
Oh, yes. I would think so.
You saw the Republican there, Jeff Flake, nodding his head vigorously. The Democrats, who are seen as more critical here, have certainly held that view. Do you hold that view? Do you think that he was evasive, as Senator Blumenthal has just said, or something more directly false?
Well, the United States Constitution calls on the Senate to advise and consent. So this is supposed to be a search for truth and not just a matter of a pure power play and patronage politics, which, frankly, it may come down to be. It may be that the majority leader in the Senate will try to just ram this thing through without regard to the outcome of the FBI investigation or any other evidence. So the question is whether or not the senators will discharge their constitutional duty, and I think they will, and actually examine the all of the facts of this case. It's not a criminal case; it's advice and consent. So there's a different standard, but it should not be allowed to become patronage politics and get a straight-up power play over whether or not this is the spoil system and the Supreme Court can go to whatever party is in power. It shouldn't be that. It should be a search for the truth and a search to get to the bottom of what all has occurred here.
And Senator Mosley Braun, the other issue is not only how Brett Kavanaugh and Dr. Ford conducted themselves. Much has been made all the way out to SNL on how it was the accuser who seemed so measured and calm, and the person being accused who seemed so, at times, emotional and upset.
Right.
But even if you wanted to be charitable and say people may respond differently to different things, he is also a sitting judge who has to return to the bench no matter what happens. And so I wonder, for your analysis, if we could compare that to what we might call the Kavanaugh standard, what he had said judges ought to do and how they ought to act. Take a look.
To be a good judge and a good umpire, it's important to have the proper demeanor. Really important, I think, to keep our emotions in check, to be calm amidst the storm. On the bench, to put it in the vernacular, don't be a jerk. I think that's important. There's a danger of arrogance, as for umpires, for referees, but also for judges.
Do you think he followed his own advice then last week?
He clearly did not. I mean, that's the reality there. He just lost it and attacked the senators who were on the panel, which was just, I thought, inappropriate and did not show judicial temperament. But having said that, what concerns me is why Republican women are not more outraged, because the Republican side of the committee, they didn't even have a female member of the Republican side of the aisle on that committee. They had to go and rent a person to come and to be the stand-in female to do the questioning. And I just think that ought to energize Republican women to say, well, why aren't there more Republican women sitting on that other side of the Senate Judiciary Committee or in the Senate period? So I think that is a very important issue here.
Senators Mosley Braun and Blumenthal, thanks to both of you. I want to turn now to Mara Gay from the New York Times editorial board and MSNBC analyst. She has a new article writing about her own experience as a sexual assault survivor. And also here, Lisa Lehrer, a political reporter for the New York Times, as well as Gene Robinson, a Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for The Washington Post. My thanks to all of you. Lisa, starting with you, what do you think is important now? We are a long ways, as I mentioned in the open, from Donald Trump claiming either this isn't what the FBI does or they should do it only with a narrow count of who they can talk to.
Look, what's important is what has always been important, which are the votes of Senator Flake, Collins, Murkowski, maybe Manchin or Heidkamp. In the end, it's hard to believe that a time-limited investigation can close every door and dot every I, especially as more issues seem to come out every day. But in the end, that may not matter. If Mitch McConnell feels he has the vote to push this thing through, he will push it through. So the deciding voices on this will be that set of 3 or 5 senators. If they feel satisfied with what has happened in the past week, then he'll bring it to a vote. If Jeff Flake does not feel satisfied, then it's hard to see how. Then Republicans are in a pretty tough spot.
Right. And Gene Robinson, I want to play a little more from Donald Trump today, because what Lisa's referring to is the fact that this is a somewhat public, messy process. No one's claiming it's all that logical and rational. Although, as I was pushing the senator on it, if you want more time and more witnesses, this would seem to be going in that direction. Take a look at the president today.
I want them to do a very comprehensive investigation. With that being said, I'd like it to go quickly.
Just for clarity, will you instruct the White House counsel, Don McGahn, to give the FBI free rein to interview whomever they feel is necessary?
Well, I have so instructed him, but I did also say within the bounds of what the Senate wants. We don't want to go on to use an expression often used by me, we don't want to go on a witch hunt.
Gene, he had to get that in there. Please don't feel any need to respond to that particular phraseology. But what do you think about that direction? And the president, look, you could say low bar, you can say low expectations, but something has moved the president. Maybe just the raw political pressure of needing a couple votes.
Well, at the very least, we have a good cop, bad cop routine going on here, where the president, for a change, is the good cop who's saying, have an investigation, look into everything, talk to anybody you need to talk to. This is what I want the FBI to do. And on the other, the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, you have Mitch McConnell saying, we're going to vote this week. I'm going to call a vote, and we're going to put it up. Now, that is, I think, in part a bluff, because he certainly will not bring it up for a vote if he doesn't think he has the votes to pass to get him Judge Kavanaugh confirmed. But it's a kind of routine going on, and I'm as confused as everybody else about how thorough this investigation will be, how quickly it can be done, and what the standard is. What's the cutoff? You find out he lied to Congress, but you can't substantiate the sexual assault charges. What do you do? Was that enough for Jeff Flake, or is that not enough for Jeff Flake?
Yeah, I don't want to get too caught up in the FBI investigation, because I do think it's important, because it means that Dr. Blasey Ford's claims are being taken seriously, and that's good. But we already have a lot of information before us, even without the FBI investigation, that suggests that Brett Kavanaugh is unfit for this role. One of those pieces of evidence is Dr. Blasey Ford herself. Her testimony is credible. Brett Kavanaugh's testimony is not credible. And there are reasons for that. And one of those reasons is because he's been misleading and injudicious and temperamental and had a hissy fit on national television. That is not what we want in a Supreme Court justice. And I think that, we should kind of remember that, because, rather than fall into the trap of, let's see whether it's possible to prove that Dr. Blasey Ford is telling the truth. I mean, it may be that there is no evidence 36 years later that can prove all the claims that she has brought up, but yet there are lots of reasons to find her testimony credible, and frankly, Brett Kavanaugh's not credible.
And Lisa, doesn't that go to the very peculiar maleness or male privilege that he would seem to inhabit, which has been, of course, a part of the discussion for many days now, which is it is hard to imagine a female judge, candidate, nominee, or senator necessarily being given the same dispensation if they comported themselves over several hours like that.
I'm smiling because it's not hard to imagine. It's completely inconceivably impossible to imagine.
I do a little bit of understatement on the show sometimes.
You're a little understating. We'd be talking about temperament. We'd be talking about all kinds of things. So clearly there is a double standard at play that seems fairly obvious for anyone who's watched these testimonies, who's watched Washington, who's watched politics. I also think there's another thing going on that's important to remember, which is that let's say this all works for Mitch McConnell and he gets confirmed and he gets put on the court. What does it do to the institution of the court? You have this highly controversial nominee. You have a broad swath, a growing swath, based on the polling of the American public, who are not comfortable with him. And then you have, future potential Justice Kavanaugh, who's going to be on the court ruling on potentially on issues of women's rights, on sexual harassment. I think it could be and then there's the temperament issue. There's the openly partisan statements he made in his testimony. That could be something that's really damaging for the court as an institution.
Right. And that also goes to, Gene, something I want to read to you that really cuts into, I think, another heart of this debate, which is what is the right ratio? And I don't think anyone has the perfect answer, but what's the right ratio between the age of an allegation and the seriousness of an allegation? Because the older and less serious, at some extreme, you say, oh, jaywalking, and it was 60 years ago, and it was in a horse and buggy jaywalking situation. People say, you know what, mind the horse, versus something super serious or super recent. I want to read to you from some of the new accounts that are coming out. Washington Post quoting on the record Charles Ludington, a declared friend of Kavanaugh's from Yale, says, look, when Brett got drunk, he was belligerent and aggressive, started a fight that ended up with one of our mutual friends in jail. Anytime you have the intersection of criminal law or the alcohol mixed with allegations of violent conduct or criminal conduct, right, you're in a little bit of a different space than just what some people like to say is, 40 years ago, these were quote-unquote wild parties. How do you see these accounts affecting it?
Well, that definitely gets your attention, but I want to go back to the point that Mara was making, which is that Dr. Blasey Ford's testimony, first of all, what she alleges is serious, and it's serious enough that there's not a statute of limitations on that, both literally and I think in terms of consideration for the Supreme Court. And second, her testimony is evidence. It is powerful. I mean, she is an incredibly credible witness, and I think I don't know anyone who listened to her last Thursday and said she was anything less than believable. So if you're going to say she's believable, then we should believe her. We should certainly give her more of a presumption of truthfulness than is being given her now. And when we say in the Me Too era, believe the woman, that doesn't mean believe the woman for half a day and then tell her to go away and shut up. Right, and it also goes to the procedural point that's in the news tonight, which is she came out, spoke under oath in public, Mark Judge speaking in private, and only speaking under oath because of what Jeff Flake and others pushed for. I mean, that wasn't at all guaranteed. Gene Robinson, Lisa Lair, and Mara Gay, as always, appreciate your expertise. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.